September 14, 2023. The Gowanus neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. A construction crew was excavating the foundation of an old industrial warehouse on 3rd Avenue, preparing the site for a luxury condominium development that would eventually rise 12 stories above the waterfront. The morning was humid, the sky a pale gray that seemed to press down upon the cranes and bulldozers like a heavy hand. Foreman Michael Castellano had been in the demolition business for 31 years, long enough to know that Brooklyn soil held secrets beneath its surface. He had found old trolley tracks, colonial-era foundations, even a 19th-century cistern filled with antique bottles. But nothing could have prepared him for what the excavator's bucket would drag from the earth that Thursday morning at precisely 9:47 a.m. The excavator operator, a 26-year-old named Danny Reyes, felt the bucket catch on something solid approximately 18 feet below the current street level. He assumed it was bedrock or perhaps an old foundation slab, the kind of obstruction that cost developers time and money. Reyes maneuvered the hydraulic arm, attempting to work around the obstacle, but the bucket kept scraping against what felt like curved metal. He signaled to Castellano, who walked over with a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. The two men peered into the pit, where decades of accumulated fill dirt, broken concrete, and industrial debris had been displaced. Something was down there, something large and rusted, something deliberately buried long before the warehouse above had been constructed. Castellano called for the work to stop immediately. The crew gathered around the excavation pit, their hard hats forming a ring of yellow and orange against the gray morning sky. As Reyes carefully removed more soil with the precision of an archaeologist, the shape began to emerge from the earth like a prehistoric beast awakening from millennia of slumber. First came the curved trunk lid, then the distinctive rear fenders, then the chromework that had somehow retained a dull gleam despite 66 years underground. It was an automobile, massive and elegant, clearly from the golden age of American automotive design. The men stood in silence, understanding instinctively that they had uncovered something significant, something that had been hidden for a reason. The vehicle was a 1956 Cadillac Coupe de Ville, a two-door hardtop finished in what had once been Cascade gray, with an Arctic white roof. The car measured 18 feet, 4 inches in length, and weighed approximately 4,600 pounds empty. Its 365 cubic inch V8 engine had once produced 305 horsepower, making it one of the most powerful luxury vehicles of its era. Even in its deteriorated state, caked with sediment and corrosion, the Cadillac retained an unmistakable aura of wealth and prestige. This was the kind of automobile that had announced its owner's arrival before he ever stepped out of the driver's seat. This was the kind of automobile that men killed for in 1950s Brooklyn. The construction crew stood frozen as Castellano descended into the pit on an aluminum ladder, his boots sinking into the disturbed earth with each step downward. He approached the Cadillac slowly, the way one might approach a sleeping animal capable of sudden violence. The windows were intact but opaque with grime, impossible to see through clearly. The doors were locked and the tires had long since rotted away, leaving the car resting on its rusted brake drums. Castellano wiped his hand across the rear window, clearing a small circle through the accumulated filth. He pressed his face close to the glass, squinting into the darkness of the interior. Then he stumbled backward, his face draining of color. Inside the Cadillac, slumped behind the steering wheel as if waiting patiently for a traffic light to change, were the skeletal remains of a human being. The bones had collapsed into the space between the seat and the steering column, the skull tilted slightly to the right, as though the person had fallen asleep during a long drive. Fragments of what appeared to be clothing still clung to the remains, dark fabric that had partially preserved in the anaerobic environment of the buried car. Castellano scrambled up the ladder, shouting for someone to call the police immediately. Within minutes, the construction site had transformed from a mundane workplace into an active crime scene, the boundaries marked by yellow tape that fluttered in the September breeze. The New York City Police Department arrived within 18 minutes of the initial call at 10:05 a.m. Detective Sergeant Patricia Delgado of the NYPD's Cold Case Squad was dispatched to the scene after patrol officers reported the discovery of human remains in an unusual context. Delgado had investigated over 300 cold cases during her 22 years on the force, but she had never encountered anything quite like this. A vintage luxury automobile buried deliberately beneath 18 feet of fill dirt, with a body entombed inside, represented either an elaborate murder concealment or the most expensive grave in Brooklyn history. She approached the pit with her partner, Detective James Kowalski. The forensic team arrived at 11:23 a.m., their white van parking among the construction vehicles, like a medical examiner arriving at a battlefield. Dr. Susan Chen, the chief medical examiner for Kings County, took personal charge of the recovery operation, recognizing immediately that this case would require extraordinary care. The Cadillac had essentially become a sealed time capsule, preserving evidence that might otherwise have decomposed decades ago. Chen ordered a tent erected over the excavation pit to protect the scene from media helicopters that were already beginning to circle overhead. Word of the discovery had spread quickly, and news vans were gathering on 3rd Avenue like vultures sensing carrion on the wind. The extraction process would take nearly 16 hours of careful work. Dr. Chen insisted on removing the Cadillac intact, lifting it from its subterranean tomb with a construction crane rather than attempting to open the doors at the scene. The car would be transported to the medical examiner's facility in Manhattan, where it could be examined under controlled laboratory conditions. As the crane cables were attached and the Cadillac slowly rose from the earth, water and sediment poured from its undercarriage like tears from ancient eyes. The crowd that had gathered behind the police barriers fell silent, watching the resurrection of something that had been buried for more than 6 decades. The Cadillac arrived at the office of the chief medical examiner at 3:47 a.m. on September 15, 2023. Dr. Chen and her team worked through the night, carefully documenting every aspect of the vehicle's exterior before attempting to access the interior compartment. The car's vehicle identification number had been removed, filed away from the dashboard plate and the door jambs, indicating a deliberate attempt to prevent identification. However, whoever had prepared this vehicular grave had overlooked a crucial detail. Cadillac also stamped the VIN on the engine block, a location that required specialized knowledge to find. When technicians cleaned the accumulated grime from the engine, they found the number still legible. The VIN number, 566X20898847, was entered into the New York State Department of Motor Vehicles historical database, which had been digitized from paper records dating back to the 1940s. Within hours, the search returned a match that would transform the case. The 1956 Cadillac Coupe de Ville had been registered on March 12, 1956, to a man named Dominic Russo, with an address listed as 247 President Street in the Carroll Gardens neighborhood of Brooklyn. The name meant nothing to the young technician who processed the search, but when Detective Delgado saw the results, she immediately recognized its significance. Dominic Russo had been one of the most powerful figures in Brooklyn organized crime. The NYPD immediately notified the FBI, which still maintained files on the Russo disappearance in its archives at the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. Within 48 hours, retired agents who had worked the case decades earlier were contacted for their recollections and expertise. Historians specializing in organized crime were consulted for context. Genealogical researchers began tracing Russo's descendants, if any survived after 66 years. The discovery had transformed from a local curiosity into a national story, one that connected the present moment to a violent chapter of American history that many had assumed would never be resolved. The Gowanus neighborhood where the Cadillac was discovered had undergone dramatic transformation since 1957. What had once been an industrial wasteland of warehouses, coal yards and chemical plants had become one of Brooklyn's most desirable real estate markets for young professionals. The Gowanus Canal, a waterway so polluted it had been designated a Superfund site in 2010, was slowly being remediated by federal contractors. Luxury condominiums now stood where longshoremen had once unloaded cargo ships from around the world. Artisanal coffee shops occupied buildings that had served as fronts for bookmaking operations. But beneath the gentrified surface, the neighborhood retained echoes of its violent past. The warehouse beneath which the Cadillac had been buried had been constructed in 1961, 4 years after Dominic Russo's disappearance from the streets he had controlled. Public records showed the building had been owned by a company called Atlantic Industrial Holdings, which itself was owned by a series of shell corporations that terminated in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. The building had served various purposes over the decades, housing a textile distributor, a furniture warehouse, and most recently a self-storage facility. None of the businesses had any idea what lay beneath their floors. The foundation had been poured directly over the buried Cadillac. As news of the discovery spread through social media and traditional outlets, reporters descended upon Brooklyn's Italian-American community seeking interviews with anyone who remembered the Russo era. Most declined to speak on the record, offering only terse denials or claims of ignorance about events that had occurred before they were born. But a few elderly residents in their 80s and 90s agreed to share memories that had been suppressed for decades. They spoke of a time when Dominic Russo had been both feared and respected, a man who settled disputes, provided loans to struggling businesses, and ensured that neighborhood services functioned properly. The medical examiner's preliminary report, released on September 18, 2023, confirmed what many had suspected from the moment the VIN search returned a match. The skeletal remains found in the Cadillac were consistent with a male individual, approximately 5 feet 10 inches in height, between 45 and 55 years of age at the time of death. Dental records from the FBI's archived files provided a positive identification. The remains were those of Dominic Paul Russo, born April 3, 1908, in Palermo, Sicily, and presumed deceased since September 1957. The cause of death appeared to be a single gunshot wound to the posterior skull. The discovery of Dominic Russo's remains answered a question that had haunted law enforcement and organized crime historians for 66 years. But it raised new questions that might never be fully resolved. Who had killed him? Why had he been buried with such elaborate care? And how had such a prominent figure simply vanished without anyone being held accountable? To understand these mysteries, it was necessary to travel back in time to the Brooklyn of 1957, a world of waterfront rackets and political corruption, of loyalty unto death and betrayals that echoed through generations. The story of Dominic Russo was the story of an era. The investigation into Dominic Russo's murder had officially been reopened, though Detective Delgado understood that prosecuting a 66-year-old homicide was virtually impossible under any realistic scenario. Anyone directly involved in the killing would almost certainly be dead by now. Witnesses who might have provided crucial testimony had long since passed away or forgotten what they knew. The case would likely remain technically open but practically unsolved, another entry in the long catalog of mob murders that defined mid-century Brooklyn. Yet Delgado also understood that solving the case and understanding the case were different things entirely. The truth could still be assembled from the fragments that remained. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in Brooklyn during the autumn of 1957 involves the violent power struggles of the five families, a man who controlled the waterfront rackets worth millions of dollars annually, and a disappearance that baffled the FBI for 6 decades. The Cadillac, buried 18 feet underground, was more than a grave. It was a message, a statement of power and contempt from killers who believed their secret would never be discovered. By the end of this story, you will understand how Dominic Russo rose from Sicilian poverty to Brooklyn royalty, why he became a threat to the most dangerous men in America, and how his final ride ended not on the open road, but in a tomb beneath the streets he had ruled. Dominic Paul Russo was 49 years old in September 1957, a stocky, powerful figure who stood 5 feet 10 inches and weighed approximately 210 pounds of muscle and determination. His hair was dark brown, silvering at the temples, and his eyes were the deep brown of Sicilian earth, described by those who knew him as capable of shifting from warm hospitality to cold menace within a single heartbeat. He favored custom-tailored suits from a shop on Montague Street, Italian leather shoes that cost more than most men earned in a week, and a gold pinky ring bearing a ruby that had allegedly belonged to his father. His face bore a thin scar along the left jawline, a souvenir from his younger days on the waterfront. Russo had arrived in America in 1922. A 14-year-old immigrant traveling alone on a steamship from Palermo with $7 sewn into the lining of his threadbare coat. His father had been killed in a dispute over water rights in their village, a vendetta that had claimed 3 generations of Russo men. His mother had sold everything the family owned to purchase passage for her eldest son to the New World, hoping to break the cycle of violence that had defined their lineage. He landed at Ellis Island on April 12, 1922, and was met by an uncle who operated a produce cart in the Carroll Gardens neighborhood of Brooklyn. Within a month, young Dominic was working on the waterfront. The Brooklyn waterfront of the 1920s was a brutal environment, a place where men competed violently for the right to work a few hours and earn a few dollars that might keep their families fed. Jobs were distributed by hiring bosses who expected kickbacks, protection payments, and absolute loyalty. Young Dominic learned quickly that survival required more than physical strength, though he possessed that in abundance. It required intelligence, the ability to read men's intentions, and the willingness to use violence strategically rather than impulsively. By his 18th birthday, he had attached himself to a crew of Sicilian dock workers who controlled loading operations at Pier 6 in Red Hook. By his 20th birthday in 1928, Dominic Russo had killed his first man, a rival dock worker who had threatened to inform the police about their operation skimming cargo from arriving ships. The body was never found. dropped into the East River with weights tied to its ankles, fish food within hours. The murder was witnessed by men who would never speak of it, and Dominic Russo's reputation was established among those whose opinions mattered in his world. He had proven himself capable of the ultimate commitment, willing to cross the line that separated ordinary criminals from men who would be respected and feared. The waterfront began to open before him. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Russo rose steadily through the ranks of Brooklyn's organized crime hierarchy, demonstrating talents that went beyond mere brutality. He showed an unusual gift for organization, for the management of men and money that went beyond simple muscle. When Prohibition created enormous opportunities for bootlegging, Russo established a network of speakeasies throughout Carroll Gardens, and Red Hook, supplied by whiskey smuggled through the waterfront he controlled. He invested his profits wisely, purchasing tenement buildings, opening legitimate businesses as fronts, and cultivating relationships with local politicians and police commanders who appreciated the regular envelopes of cash. In 1933, Russo married Maria Concetta Falcone, the daughter of a prosperous Brooklyn baker, who had initially opposed the match with every argument at his disposal. Maria was 23 years old, beautiful and educated, a graduate of St. Joseph's Academy who had trained as a teacher before her father's heart attack forced her to leave school and help run the family business. She understood exactly what kind of man Dominic Russo was, and she accepted him anyway, recognizing in him a strength and determination that would provide security in uncertain times. Their wedding at St. Agnes Church on President Street was attended by over 400 guests. The Russo household occupied a brownstone at 247 President Street, a four-story building that Dominic had purchased outright in 1931 and renovated extensively to reflect his rising status. The ground floor served as the family's living quarters, while the upper floors were rented to carefully selected tenants whose loyalty could be assured. The basement contained a private office where Russo conducted business away from prying eyes, its walls lined with cork to muffle sound, its single window covered with a steel grate that allowed light but prevented access. Maria Russo maintained the household with meticulous care, creating an oasis of domesticity within a world of violence. Dominic and Maria would have 3 children who would grow up insulated from their father's true profession: Anthony, born in 1935, Joseph, born in 1938, and Lucia, born in 1941. Russo proved to be a devoted father despite the demands of his other life, insisting that his children receive the finest education available, attending Catholic schools that prepared them for lives far removed from the waterfront where their father had begun. He attended every communion and confirmation, every school play and graduation ceremony, always arriving in his Cadillac with a gift for the nuns who taught his children. He wanted something better for them. The children grew up believing their father was a successful businessman in the import trade, which was technically true if one did not examine the nature of the imports too closely. Anthony would eventually attend Fordham University and become a lawyer specializing in corporate litigation. Joseph would study medicine at Columbia and become a psychiatrist. Lucia would marry a stockbroker and move to Connecticut, raising children in a world of country clubs and charitable committees. Their father's criminal empire made their respectable futures possible, purchasing opportunities that would have been denied to the children of an immigrant dock worker without connections. By the late 1940s, Dominic Russo had become underboss of what law enforcement would eventually designate as the Profaci crime family, one of the 5 families that controlled organized crime in New York City. His territory encompassed the Red Hook and Carroll Gardens neighborhoods, including the crucial waterfront infrastructure that handled millions of dollars in legitimate and illegitimate cargo annually. Every longshoreman who worked the piers paid tribute to Russo's organization. Every trucking company that moved goods from the docks paid for protection. Every businessman who operated in the neighborhood understood that cooperation with Russo guaranteed security. Russo's relationship with family boss Joseph Profaci was complicated by fundamental differences in philosophy and temperament, built on mutual benefit rather than personal loyalty. Profaci, a Sicilian immigrant who had arrived in America in 1921, had established himself as the head of Brooklyn's dominant crime organization by the early 1930s through a combination of ruthlessness and business acumen. He was a cautious man, deeply religious despite his criminal activities, who preferred negotiation to violence and stability to expansion. Russo served as his enforcer and administrator, handling the day-to-day operations of the waterfront rackets, while Profaci focused on broader strategic concerns. The arrangement between Russo and Profaci worked well for nearly 2 decades, generating profits for both men and maintaining peace within the organization. But by the mid-1950s, tensions had begun to emerge that would eventually prove fatal. Russo believed he deserved a larger share of the organization's profits, arguing that his waterfront operations generated the majority of the family's income while Profazzi took an outsized portion for himself. Profazzi insisted on maintaining the traditional distribution that kept peace among his captains, viewing any challenge to the established order as a threat to stability. The AS conflict remained hidden from public view, expressed through the subtle withdrawal of cooperation. Russo began conducting independent operations without informing Profazzi, establishing gambling networks and loan-sharking businesses that bypassed the family's commission structure entirely. He cultivated relationships with members of other families, particularly the Anastasia organization based in Manhattan, whose boss Albert Anastasia had his own grievances against the established order of the Five Families. By 1957, rumors were circulating through the underworld that Russo had become unreliable, that his ambition exceeded his judgment, and that Profazzi was considering how to address the problem without triggering a war that would draw unwanted attention from federal law enforcement. Russo's alliance with Albert Anastasia was both his greatest opportunity and his most dangerous liability, a gamble that would ultimately cost him everything. Anastasia, known throughout the underworld as the Mad Hatter and the Lord High Executioner, had risen to power through a reputation for casual violence that even seasoned criminals found disturbing. He had co-founded Murder Inc., the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, personally ordering or committing dozens of killings during the 1930s and 1940s. By 1957, he controlled the most powerful crime family in New York, but his erratic behavior had alienated potential allies. The waterfront operations that Russo controlled represented the economic foundation of his power and his value to any potential alliance. The Red Hook piers handled cargo from ships arriving from around the world, including goods both legal and illegal that generated millions in annual revenue. Longshoremen who wanted to work paid a daily tribute to Russo's men, a system known as the shape-up that enriched the organization while keeping workers desperate and compliant. Trucking companies paid protection to ensure their vehicles were not vandalized or hijacked. Warehouse operators paid for the privilege of storing goods without interference from thieves or inspectors. September 1957 was a month of unusual tension in Brooklyn's underworld, with whispered conversations in social clubs and nervous glances from men who sensed a storm approaching. Russo's men reported increased surveillance by FBI agents who had been emboldened by the recent formation of the Top Hoodlum program under Director J. Edgar Hoover. Local police detectives, usually cooperative with men in Russo's position, had become strangely distant, refusing meetings and ignoring the regular payment schedule that had maintained their loyalty for years. Several of Russo's trusted lieutenants had expressed concerns about their safety, mentioning rumors of a coming purge. In the days before his disappearance, Russo made arrangements that suggested he sensed danger approaching, but believed he could survive whatever challenge came. He instructed Maria to visit her sister in New Jersey with the children, ensuring that they would be away from the city if trouble arrived at their door. He met privately with his lawyer to review his will and the trusts established for his children's education. He transferred large sums of cash from his various accounts to locations that only he knew. He began carrying a Smith & Wesson revolver that he had not worn in years, tucked into a holster beneath his tailored jacket. The last confirmed sighting of Dominic Russo alive occurred on September 23, 1957, at approximately 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. He was observed by FBI surveillance agents leaving the Longshore Restroom, a bar on President Street that served as an unofficial headquarters for his organization. Russo walked to his 1956 Cadillac, parked in front of a hydrant with the casual arrogance of a man who never received parking tickets, and drove away toward the Gowanus Canal. The agents attempted to follow but lost him in traffic near the intersection of 3rd Avenue and Union Street. They reported the loss to their supervisor and returned to their regular surveillance position. Maria Russo did not report her husband missing until September 26, 3 days after his last confirmed sighting by FBI surveillance. She later explained to investigators that Dominic often disappeared for days at a time on business matters, and that she had learned not to ask questions about his whereabouts or activities. When he failed to appear for Sunday dinner, a weekly family tradition he had never missed in 24 years of marriage, Maria became genuinely concerned for the first time. When he still had not returned by Monday morning, she called the President Street Social Club and spoke with his lieutenants, who admitted they had not seen him either. The FBI launched an immediate investigation into Russo's disappearance, recognizing that the vanishing of such a prominent organized crime figure was likely connected to larger power. Struggles within the New York underworld that agents had been monitoring for months. Agents interviewed dozens of associates, informants, and competitors, assembling a portrait of a man who had made many enemies in his rise to power. The 1956 Cadillac was listed as stolen, its description distributed to police departments throughout the northeastern United States. Wiretaps on suspected mob social clubs were reviewed for any mention of Russo or his fate, but the recordings revealed only careful silence. Exactly 1 month after Russo's disappearance, on October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia was murdered in the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. 2 gunmen, their faces concealed by scarves, approached Anastasia while he sat in the barber's chair receiving a shave and shot him repeatedly with .38 caliber revolvers until he fell to the floor amid shattered mirrors and screaming patrons. The killing was witnessed by multiple people but never officially solved, though. Investigators quickly concluded it was a carefully orchestrated mob hit approved at the highest levels of the commission. The timing suggested a direct connection to Russo's disappearance. 3 weeks after Anastasia's murder, on November 14, 1957, law enforcement stumbled upon one of the most important gatherings in American organized crime history. State police in Appalachian, New York, noticed unusual activity at the estate of Joseph Barbara, a local businessman with suspected mob connections. When officers approached the property, they discovered approximately 100 men in expensive suits fleeing into the surrounding woods like deer startled by hunters. Among those detained and identified were the bosses of nearly every major crime family in America, including Vito Genovese, Joseph Profaci, and Carlo Gambino. The Appalachian meeting exposed the national scope of organized crime to public attention and triggered a federal crackdown that would reshape the underworld for decades to come. Several attendees later testified that one purpose of the meeting was to discuss the distribution of territory left vacant by recent disappearances and deaths, including that of Dominic Russo. The FBI noted that Russo's waterfront operations had been quietly absorbed by Profaci's organization in the weeks following his disappearance, with no evident resistance from his former lieutenants. The smooth transition suggested either prior arrangement or thorough intimidation of anyone who might have objected. The FBI's investigation into Russo's disappearance continued through 1958 and 1959, gradually accumulating circumstantial evidence about possible motives and suspects without achieving a definitive breakthrough that would allow prosecution. Agents identified several competing theories about what might have happened to the missing underboss. Theory 1 suggested Russo was killed on orders from Joseph Profaci as punishment for his independent operations and his dangerous alliance with Anastasia. Theory 2 proposed Russo was killed by Anastasia's successors as part of the broader purge that eliminated the Mad Hatter's support network. Theory 3 suggested Russo was killed by rivals within his own organization. Despite intensive investigation, no physical evidence supported any of these theories conclusively, and by 1960 the case had effectively gone cold. The investigation officially remained open, but received minimal attention through the 1960s and 1970s. Occasionally, an informant would mention Russo's name in connection with historical events, or a dying mobster would hint at knowledge he was unwilling to share even on his deathbed. The FBI maintained a file on the case, updating it periodically with new information that never quite amounted to a breakthrough. Advances in forensic technology offered hope that physical evidence, if ever recovered, might eventually provide answers. Maria Russo never remarried despite many years of widowhood and proposals from men who saw advantage in connection to her late husband's organization. She remained in the brownstone on President Street until her death in 1994, maintaining the household exactly as it had been during Dominic's lifetime as a kind of shrine to his memory. His clothes remained in the closet, his office in the basement unchanged, his chair at the dining room table always set for meals that he would never eat. She refused interviews from journalists, researchers, and law enforcement, revealing nothing about what she knew or suspected about her husband's fate. Anthony Russo, Dominic's eldest son, pursued a career in law that maintained a careful distance from his father's world, as though he could escape the shadow through professional respectability. He graduated from Fordham Law School in 1959, just 2 years after his father's disappearance, and joined a Manhattan firm specializing in corporate litigation far removed from criminal defense. He married a woman from a respectable Connecticut family who knew nothing of his background until after the wedding. They had 4 children, none of whom learned about their grandfather's true profession until they were adults. Anthony died of cancer in 2018. Joseph Russo, the second son, became a psychiatrist with a practice in suburban New Jersey, specializing in questions that seemed to reflect his own unexamined history. He was fascinated by questions of memory and trauma, spending much of his career studying how families processed violent histories across generations. Those who knew his background saw bitter irony in his professional interests, but Joseph never acknowledged any personal connection to his research in interviews or publications. He remained close to his mother until her death and visited the President Street brownstone regularly. Joseph passed away in 2021, 2 years before the discovery of his father's remains. Lucia Russo, the youngest child and only daughter, escaped her father's shadow most completely by physical and social distance from Brooklyn. She married young, moved to Connecticut, and raised 3 children in a world of country clubs and church committees where no one asked uncomfortable questions about family history. Her husband's family accepted the story that her father had been a successful businessman who died before they met, and Lucia never corrected the impression. When pressed for details about her childhood, she would change the subject with a practiced ease that suggested decades of experience in deflection and denial. The streets of Carroll Gardens changed dramatically in the decades following Russo's disappearance, transforming from immigrant enclave to gentrified neighborhood. The Italian-American community that had formed his power base gradually dispersed to suburbs on Long Island and in New Jersey, replaced by young professionals seeking affordable alternatives to Manhattan's impossible real estate market. The social clubs that had served as headquarters for organized crime operations closed one by one, converted into restaurants and boutiques. The waterfront that Russo had controlled was transformed from industrial infrastructure into residential development. The Longshore restroom, where Russo had conducted much of his business and been last seen alive, closed in 1978 and was demolished to make way for a parking lot that charged premium rates to commuters. The brownstone at 247 President Street was sold after Maria Russo's death in 1994, renovated extensively by developers, and divided into apartments that rented for thousands of dollars per month. The new owners discovered several curious items during renovation, including a safe behind a wall in the basement office that had been welded shut and contained nothing but dust and silence when finally opened. The Gowanus Canal, which had served as a disposal site for industrial waste and allegedly human remains throughout the 20th century, was designated a federal Superfund site in 2010. Environmental remediation efforts began documenting the extent of contamination, discovering everything from heavy metals to volatile organic compounds in the waterway's sediment. Occasionally, cleanup crews found objects that hinted at darker histories. A cement block with a chain attached, a rusted automobile stripped of identifying features, the remnants of equipment that might have been used for purposes better left unexplored. No human remains were definitively identified in the canal. The discovery of Russo's Cadillac in September 2023 reopened not just a criminal case but a window into a vanished world that most Brooklyn residents had never known existed. Historians and journalists descended upon the neighborhood, interviewing survivors who remembered the 1950s, examining archives that documented the era's power structures, attempting to reconstruct the context in which a man could simply disappear without consequence. Documentary. Filmmakers began production on projects exploring the case's significance. True crime podcasts dedicated episodes to analyzing the available evidence. The story captured public imagination. The forensic examination of the Cadillac and its contents continued through the autumn of 2023, revealing details that helped reconstruct Russo's final hours with increasing precision. His clothing, partially preserved by the sealed environment of the buried vehicle, was consistent with what he had been wearing when last observed by FBI surveillance, suggesting he was killed shortly after his final confirmed sighting. A Smith & Wesson .38 revolver was found beneath the driver's seat, fully loaded and unfired, indicating that Russo had not had the opportunity to defend himself against his killers. A leather briefcase in the back seat of the Cadillac contained $47,000 in cash, adjusted for inflation equivalent to approximately $520,000 in 2023 dollars. The money suggested Russo had been en route to a significant transaction when he was killed, and whoever murdered him had not done so for robbery. The cash was likely payment for something, or bait for a trap that had closed before Russo understood his danger. Additional items in the briefcase included business documents, a notebook with cryptic entries, and a photograph of Maria and the children that Russo had apparently carried with him. The gunshot wound to Russo's skull was consistent with execution-style killing, delivered from behind at close range by someone he had trusted enough to allow such proximity. The angle of the wound suggested he was sitting in the driver's seat when shot, probably believing he was about to conduct business with associates. The single shot indicated professional efficiency, the confidence of a killer who knew one bullet would suffice. No shell casing was found in the vehicle, suggesting the killer had used a revolver rather than a semi-automatic pistol, or had carefully collected the evidence before burial. Dr. Chen's team recovered additional evidence that helped identify other individuals who had been present in the Cadillac before or during Russo's death. Hair samples found on the passenger seat did not match Russo's DNA profile and were submitted for genealogical analysis that might identify relatives of whoever had accompanied him on his final drive. Fingerprints lifted from the interior, remarkably preserved by the sealed environment, were compared against historical FBI databases without producing definitive matches. Soil samples from the car's wheel wells were analyzed for geographical markers. In January 2024, genealogical DNA analysis produced a significant breakthrough that pointed toward but could not definitively identify the killer. The hair samples found in the Cadillac were traced to a family line that intersected with known associates of the Profaci crime family. While the specific individual could not be definitively identified after 66 years, the evidence suggested that someone connected to Russo's own organization had been present when he died. This aligned with the prevailing theory that Russo had been eliminated by his own people, either on Profaci's orders or by rivals who saw his ambition as a threat. The location where the Cadillac was buried also yielded significant information that supported the theory of organizational involvement in the killing. Property records showed that in 1957 the site had been a vacant lot, owned by a shell company eventually traced to associates of the Profaci family. The same company had arranged for the lot to be filled with construction debris during the months following Russo's disappearance, raising the ground level significantly and concealing the buried vehicle beneath tons of material. The elaborate preparation suggested planning and resources available only to organized crime. Historians noted that Russo's burial with his Cadillac carried symbolic significance within the underworld culture of the 1950s. The car had been a symbol of his success, his power, his transformation from immigrant dock worker to criminal royalty. Burying him within his most prized possession was both a mark of respect, acknowledging his status among equals, and a message of contempt, demonstrating that even his greatest achievements could be erased. The single shot to the back of the head was similarly symbolic, a traditional execution method reserved for traitors. By spring 2024, the investigation had assembled a probable narrative of Russo's final hours based on forensic evidence, historical records, and informed speculation. On the evening of September 23, 1957, Russo received a message requesting a meeting at a location near the Gowanus Canal, supposedly to discuss a business opportunity too sensitive to mention by phone. He drove his Cadillac to the meeting point, where he was joined by at least one trusted associate who served as a guide or a decoy. At some point, during the drive, a third party entered the vehicle and shot him from behind while he sat behind the wheel. The investigation could not establish with certainty who had ordered Russo's death, though Joseph Profaci remained the most likely suspect based on motive, means, and opportunity. Profaci had the motive, given Russo's independent operations and his alliance with Anastasia. He had the means, controlling resources sufficient to arrange an elaborate burial that would never be discovered, and he had the opportunity, possessing detailed knowledge of Russo's movements and relationships with trusted associates who could be turned. Profaci himself died of liver cancer in 1962, taking whatever he knew about Russo's fate to his own grave. In March 2024, the Russo family held a private funeral mass at St. Agnes Church, the same location where Dominic and Maria had married 91 years earlier, in a ceremony attended by 400 guests. The remains, finally released by the medical examiner after 6 months of examination, were placed in a mahogany casket and buried beside Maria in Greenwood Cemetery. Fewer than 30 people attended the service, mostly elderly relatives and a handful of historians who had received permission to observe from a respectful distance. Father Michael Torrente spoke of forgiveness and redemption. Lucia Russo, now 83, spoke briefly to reporters after the funeral, her first and only public statement about her father after a lifetime of silence. She described him as a loving parent who had always prioritized his family's welfare, who had attended every school event and birthday celebration, who had taught his children to work hard and value education above all other pursuits. She acknowledged that he had made choices she could not defend, that his life had contained darkness she had never fully understood. But she also insisted that he deserved to rest in peace after 66 years underground. The case file on Dominic Russo's murder remains officially open with the NYPD Cold Case Squad, though Detective Delgado acknowledges that prosecution is effectively impossible. Anyone directly involved in the killing would be over 100 years old if still alive, and no surviving witnesses have come forward with actionable information despite publicity about the discovery. The evidence recovered from the Cadillac has been archived for potential future analysis, should technological advances enable additional discoveries. The genealogical DNA traces continue to be investigated by researchers attempting to identify specific individuals, The discovery of Dominic Russo's remains prompted renewed interest in other unsolved mob disappearances from the same era, suggesting that Brooklyn might hold more secrets beneath its streets. Researchers began examining vacant lots and construction sites throughout Brooklyn and Queens, searching for locations that might conceal similar secrets waiting for demolition crews to uncover them. The Hole, a notorious dumping ground on the Brooklyn-Queens border, received particular attention as investigators wondered how many bodies might remain undiscovered beneath its flooded surface. For the residents of the Gowanus neighborhood, the discovery was a reminder that gentrification could not entirely erase the past, no matter how many artisanal coffee shops opened or how high condominium prices climbed. The luxury buildings rising on 3rd Avenue stood upon foundations that had buried not just a car but a human being, not just evidence but an entire era of violence and corruption. Some found this history disturbing, others found it fascinating, a connection to a dramatic past that made their contemporary neighborhood more interesting and marketable. 66 years is a long time to wait for answers that can never be complete. Children were born, grew old, and died during the decades that Dominic Russo lay beneath the streets of Brooklyn he had once controlled. The world changed in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1957. Men walked on the moon. The Soviet Union collapsed. Computers became ubiquitous. The neighborhood Russo had controlled transformed beyond recognition. Through all of it, he remained in darkness, patient and silent, preserved in his Cadillac like a pharaoh in his tomb, waiting for someone to finally excavate the truth. Rest in peace, Dominic Russo. Your long journey is finally over. After 66 years buried beneath the streets, you once ruled, you have been brought back into the light by construction workers who never knew your name. The Cadillac that was meant to be your eternal tomb has instead become your memorial. A reminder of an era when men like you could rise and fall without accountability, when power meant everything and loyalty meant nothing. Your family finally knows what happened. The city finally has an answer to a question that haunted investigators for generations. And you are finally where you should have been all along, beside your wife in consecrated ground, at peace beneath a headstone that bears your name instead of anonymous beneath tons of Brooklyn soil. The legacy of Dominic Russo extends beyond his own story into the broader history of organized crime in America and its transformation over 7 decades. His disappearance occurred at a pivotal moment, just weeks before the Appalachian meeting exposed the Mafia to unprecedented public scrutiny and federal attention. The methods used to conceal his death, the elaborate burial with his automobile, represented the last gasp of an era when such crimes could be committed with virtual impunity. Today, surveillance technology, DNA analysis, and digital records make such disappearances nearly impossible. The Russo case has become a teaching example in law enforcement academies and criminology courses, illustrating both the sophisticated methods of mid-century organized crime and the potential for modern forensic science to illuminate mysteries across decades of concealment. Students examine the case to understand how criminal organizations maintain discipline through fear, how power struggles within such organizations played out through violence, and how advances in technology eventually caught up with crimes that their perpetrators believed would never be discovered. For the remaining members of Brooklyn's Italian-American community who remember the old days, the discovery prompted complex emotions that defied simple categorization. Some felt that justice had been served in its own way, that Russo's crimes had finally caught up with him even if his killers would never face prosecution. Others felt sympathy for a man whose only offense had been ambition, in a world where ambition was either rewarded with power or punished with death. Most simply reflected on how much had changed since the days when men like Dominic Russo controlled their neighborhood. The abandoned warehouse on 3rd Avenue where the Cadillac was discovered has been transformed into the foundation for luxury condominiums that sell for millions of dollars. Real estate agents mention the site's history in their marketing materials, finding that macabre heritage actually increases rather than decreases property values among buyers seeking connection to authentic New York history. The excavation pit where workers first spotted the buried car has been paved over and landscaped, with no marker indicating what once lay beneath. The 1956 Cadillac Coupe de Ville, now empty of its passenger and evidence, awaits a final decision about its disposition in an NYPD storage facility. Several museums have made competing offers to acquire it for permanent display, arguing that the vehicle represents an important artifact of American criminal and automotive history. The Russo family continues to contest these claims, asserting that the car should be returned to them as inherited property regardless of its use in a crime. Until the legals questions are resolved, the Cadillac remains in limbo, much as its passenger remained in limbo for 66 years underground.